You're watching C-SPAN 2, created for you as a public service by America's cable TV companies. Next, financier and philanthropist George Soros on the Bush administration's foreign policy. We'll show you a Pentagon update on rebuilding the Iraqi police force and the unveiling of a new display for the Constitution and Declaration of Independence.
Good afternoon. I'm Morton Halperin. I'm the director of the Washington office of the Open Society Institute. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the first of what will be a series of monthly Open Society forums in which we hope to bring you some of the most interesting and innovative thinkers on issues affecting open society at home and abroad. And of course, as we thought about who we wanted to open the series, it was clear that there was only one possible answer to that question. I think many of you know George Soros as a financier. Many of you know him as a philanthropist. Some of you may recently have read about him as a political activist, a subject which we will not be discussing today. But many of you may not know that he's also a serious thinker and analyst of contemporary international problems, and most recently he has turned his attention to the problems of America's role in the world and the danger of our current policies, and we're delighted and honored that he's agreed to come and share his thoughts with us.
Thank you very much. Actually, I don't approve of your choice of a speaker because I see a certain conflict of interest between being the funder of the Open Society and also a sort of a great thinker. I prefer to keep the two separate, and I would like to really talk to you more about where I stand, because recently I have reoriented my interest. As you probably know, I have set up a network of foundations over the last 25 years that were basically directed primarily at the communist countries and other closed societies like apartheid South Africa. The goal of the foundation was to promote open societies. I originally, when I set up the foundation in 1979, I defined the goals as helping opening up closed societies, help make open societies more viable, and foster a critical mode of thinking. And actually, I started in apartheid South Africa, then I got involved in my native country, Hungary, and from there, some other, China, Poland, the Soviet Union, where in Hungary we established the foundation in '84 when the communists were still in power, in the Soviet Union in '87, when Sakharov was called by Gorbachev to resume his patriotic activities in Moscow. It was in December '86, and I took that to be a signal that something has really changed. And from there, it became a network of foundations. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the concept of open society. It's basically just a broader definition of a democratic, market-oriented, rule of law society, based on the recognition that nobody, that we all act on the basis of imperfect understanding, that nobody is in possession of the ultimate truth, and any ideology that claims to be in possession of it, it becomes a threat to an open society, because that ideology can only be imposed by force, given the fact that different people have different views and different interests. And we need institutions that allow them to live together, the institutions of an open society. So that was the unifying idea. And the foundation, I think, did pretty well because they, instead of me or a small group of people telling people in the various countries what they ought to be doing, we really empowered the people in the country to decide what it is that they need to do to build their own open societies. So we empowered them. And I think it really worked. Now I have come to the conclusion that I have to reorient my interests, and I have to pay more attention to this country, which is an open society. But I think this is where the future of the world is being decided. My sort of change of orientation is based on two considerations. One, that in fact we are the dominant force in the world, that it's the United States that determines the nature of the discourse in the world. We set the policies that the rest of the world has to respond to. We can't impose our will on the rest of the world, as we are now finding out at great cost, for instance, in Iraq. But in fact, nothing can be done, or not nothing, very little can be done in the way of international cooperation without American leadership, or at least active participation. So this is the basis in reality that makes America very, very important for the world. But in addition to that, I think we are now being led by people who follow a false and dangerous ideology that is a danger to open society in this country and globally. They are normally referred to as neoconservatives or neocons. I call them American supremacists. And the ideology basically holds that international relations are relations of power, and international law basically follows power. What power accomplishes, international law legalizes. And since we are very powerful, we are in a position to impose our views, our interests, our values on the rest of the world. And I think that is a very dangerous ideology for us and for the world. So this is what has, these are the two considerations that have led me to pay much more attention to what the United States stands for. I think this ideology, this American supremacist ideology, it's only one of the factors or one of the influences in the administration, but it was present before September 11. There was a group called a Project for a New American Century that was formed in 1997, that basically its mission statement expanded this idea that America has to be strong militarily, that we are not exploiting our position sufficiently, we are not forceful enough in our policies, and we should be spending more money on the military. And in '98, there was a letter to Clinton which advocated the invasion of Iraq. So it is something that predates September 11. But before September 11, there were some real obstacles to implementing this policy. One is that the administration, the president, did not really have a mandate for it. He campaigned on a humble foreign policy, and he won by a very narrow margin, one vote on the Supreme Court. So he did not have a real mandate. And secondly, we didn't really have an enemy which would justify increasing our military power. Our arch enemy, Soviet Union, had collapsed. So what would justify this increase in military expenditures? At that time, the core of the agenda was missile defense, because NATO, after the end of the Cold War, had ceased to be an instrument of American supremacy. During the Cold War, the rest of the world, the rest of Europe, was very happy to accept American leadership in NATO. People were willing and eager to have that leadership to defend against the Soviet Union. But afterwards, that impulse wasn't there anymore, and NATO became effectively a multilateral institution, no longer an instrument of American superiority, whereas missile defense would allow us to regain that control over that unilateral control.
We appear to be having trouble with the sound system, and it would be better if you could just speak loudly and turn this off. Would that be okay? Okay.
I don't believe in conspiracy theories, so
You may want to test if they can hear you.
yeah. Can you hear me if I speak just like this? Is that okay?
This is our mic.
Yeah. Okay. Is okay? Yeah. So NATO was no longer that instrument of unilateral American domination that it had been during the Cold War. Missile defense, however, would give us the ability to decide whom we defend and when. So it would give us back that power. So that was missile defense. But there was the difficulty of who is our enemy. And to start with, North Korea could serve as let's say, the enemy for the first phase. And in fact, when President of South Korea, Kim Dae-jung, came here to get President Bush to endorse the sunshine policy, he was rebuffed because we needed North Korea out in the cold to justify the first phase of the missile defense. And then we were sort of tempted about China. Is it a strategic rival? Even Russia was considered as a possible future enemy. September 11 changed all this, because suddenly we had a real, very real enemy. And President Bush declared war on terrorism, and he gained an overwhelming mandate for that war. Now, I think that is where things started getting off the rail, as far as I can judge. Because I think waging war is not the right way to deal with terrorism. Because terrorism was a crime against humanity, and it requires being treated as a crime. It requires police action. It requires awareness. It requires information. You need to track down the terrorists, and you have to deal with them, capture them, and bring them to justice. And for that, you need the allegiance of the populations and the support of the populations where terrorists live. When you wage war, you have to have an enemy that you can identify, preferably a state. And this is what has led us to pursue the war against states that are supposed to harbor terrorists, rather than pursue the terrorists themselves. Of course, invasion of Afghanistan was fully justified, because that is where bin Laden lived. When it came to Iraq, the connection became much more dubious, because we justified the invasion of Iraq by weapons of mass destruction that Saddam is supposed to possess, and a connection with terrorists and weapons of mass destruction. And this was necessary because the mandate that the president had was to fight terrorism. So we had to connect the invasion of Iraq with terrorism. Now, I think that Saddam was a heinous dictator, and it needs to be, it's wonderful to get rid of him, and there may be very good reasons for moving against Saddam, but those other reasons were not discussed at all. And when we now did not find any weapons of mass destruction, and the connection with Al-Qaeda at that time was never properly established, we fall back on the idea that we were bringing democracy to Iraq, which I think is a highly desirable objective. But this is an activity in which I personally have been deeply involved for the last 20 years, building democracies, open societies. And Iraq would be the last country that I would choose for a demonstration site. And military invasion is the least efficient way of introducing democracy. So I think this is where things have really gotten off the wrong track. Basically, in fact, the real issue that agitates me is the Bush doctrine, which I consider a very pernicious doctrine. Because if you examine it, it basically built on two pillars. One, that we will do everything to maintain our military superiority, which I think is a very worthwhile and desirable objective. And the second, that we claim the right of preemptive action. And that, if you put the two things together, you basically establish two classes of sovereignty. The sovereignty of the United States, which is not subject to any international constraints, and the sovereignty of all the other states, which is subject to the Bush doctrine. It's reminiscent of George Orwell's Animal Farm. All animals are equal, except some animals are more equal than others. And of course, the Bush doctrine is in fact buried in a lot of Orwellian doublespeak. But this is what it boils down to. And it is a doctrine that is basically goes contrary to American values, goes contrary to the principles of open society, and it is an unattainable goal. And it cannot possibly be accepted by the rest of the world. And in fact, what has gone wrong is that the rest of the world had an allergic reaction to the Bush doctrine. In other words, there could have been lots of grounds for collective action against Saddam. And in fact, under the pressure from the United States, the Security Council passed a very strong resolution which gave very intrusive inspection rights. And in fact, whatever danger Saddam represented was contained and could have been contained indefinitely. So now, I think what is happening in Iraq is demonstrating, it's the proof that this approach of American supremacy is a false approach. The United States does occupy a dominant position in the world, but it has reached its dominance exactly by not abusing its power, but by being concerned with the opinions and interests of others and allowing a world order which basically assured freedom for those who sought it. So we now have a situation where we have achieved the opposite of what we were aiming at, because not only are our soldiers in danger, but also our ability to project power has been greatly diminished, because our armed forces are engaged in pursuing a role of policemen, role of occupation, whereas that has never been the strength of our military forces. It's always been to project power, to bring overwhelming force to bear, and now we are bogged down in a quagmire in Iraq. So I think that this is now the moment of truth, that we can see that this is a very dangerous approach, and we need a different one. I think we have to start with the recognition of our dominant position and the responsibility that that dominant position imposes on us. It's a unique responsibility because we have to be actually concerned with the well-being of the world, because we are the only ones who can initiate and carry through collective actions to improve conditions in the world. And that includes fighting terrorism, preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and of course to improve the state of the world, because you know the global system that we currently have is a very beneficial system, but it has great weaknesses that need to be corrected. And as I say, we are the only ones who can do it, and we can only do it with the help of others acting in a collective manner. So that, I think we need a different vision of America's role in the world. We have a world order which is we have become increasingly interdependent because of the globalization of the markets, particularly financial markets. So we are very, very interdependent, more than we have been in the past. But the political arrangements are still based on the sovereignty of states. And it is very difficult to interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign states. Yet, clearly, because of our interdependence, it's very important that we should be able to do so. So there is an unsolved problem confronting us. How, on what grounds can you interfere in internal affairs of other states? Now, I think the first step is that you can, if you bring assistance, you are not interfering because it is either accepted or not. So it's willingly accepted. So that is not interfering. And we are not doing enough of that. There needs to be a greater concern with development, helping the less developed countries to benefit from the global capitalist system. So this has to be the first step. But then there are countries with, there is Saddam Hussein, and there are many other countries with rulers like Saddam Hussein, and I could give you a long list. We can't invade them all. We need to invade maybe sometimes, but that has to be the last resort. So this idea that of preemptive action of a military kind, I think is the wrong way to go about it. I think we have to reverse it, and we have to engage in preventive action of a constructive, affirmative nature, and keep the military option as a last resort. So I would like to propose a different doctrine to replace the Bush doctrine. And if we do that, I think we could regain the position that we have enjoyed before, of the respect and support from the rest of the world. That is my proposition for America's role in the world. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions. I'd ask you to identify yourself and state the question quickly. Yes, right in the middle.
John Isaac, you would get a fair amount of support for this idea within the Republican Party, but Republicans have been notoriously silent. How do you get Republicans to give that same message?
Well, I don't know if I'm supposed to get into party politics at this meeting, but I don't think that I'm overstepping the mark by saying that one of the structural weaknesses of our democracy today is that the Republican Party has been largely captured by extremist forces. And the moderate Republicans are today an endangered species. And what we need most of all is actually the revival of a moderate Republican Party, a better balance in the Republican Party. And I would say that I could well be a moderate Republican myself.
Yes.
David Korn from The Nation magazine. Why do you think that the neocons take the position that they do take? They want to be supremacists and dominate the world, so to speak. Put crassly, what's in it for them? I mean, what do they want to get from their position of supremacy?
Well, it's very difficult for me to understand exactly, but to some extent, Wolfowitz and I are not that far apart. We actually used to be colleagues advocating a more aggressive American policy in the Balkans. We were part of a small group called the Action Council for the Balkans. So we were colleagues there. And frankly, I didn't realize that we are so far apart. I think that there is a lack of understanding of the first principles of an open society, namely that we may be wrong, that democratic values are not necessarily American values, that if you liberate the Iraqis from Saddam's oppression, it doesn't mean that they will have a pro-American government unless you impose it on them and send in some emigre who's closely allied with the Defense Department. So this is the basic misunderstanding, I think, in the neocon circles. And frankly, what concerns me is that the United States, being in the dominant position that it is in, does have to take an active role in the world, has to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, but it has to do so as part of an international community. So by going it alone and imposing our will and riding roughshod over the opinion of the rest of the world, we are disqualifying ourselves from playing that role. And the failure of the policy may well lead the American public to want to withdraw. We've always been flirting with isolationism. So this is what I'm really concerned with, that by going about it the wrong way, we are destroying our chances of being a constructive leader of the world.
In the back.
Women's Learning Partnership. Actually, I came to this country some 24 years ago after the Iranian Revolution, and I enjoyed very much the certainty in this country that even though I was an exile and I was coming from another country and all that, that there are certain rights that were mine to share with the others. Unfortunately, in recent times, what I see is some of the things that are happening in this country are not that different from what is happening back there. People are disappeared, people are guilty before proven, they have to prove their innocence, and so forth. And I'm so glad that you're actually bringing this whole mobilization effort forward, because it seems to me that what is even more dangerous than the aggressive attitude of the United States overseas is the degeneration of what makes this country a leading force in the world. Right now, I personally grieve the disintegration of those rights in this country a lot more than I do out there in my country of origin, because there's nowhere to turn, there's nowhere to go. This is one's last best hope. And I was wondering if you might comment as to what can happen. Is there only regime change here as it is there? That is our only possibility? Or how can we mobilize in order to save these rights and these infrastructural foundations that are a beacon to the rest of the world?
Well, I think the first step is for us to recognize that we are going in the wrong direction. That has to be the starting point. And of course, September 11 was such a traumatic experience, and it has been exploited, if I may say, by the administration, fostering fear and maintaining that everything has changed after September 11, that standards of behavior that previously were not acceptable have become acceptable because this is an emergency and we are threatened in our very existence. This is where we are in danger of endangering our position as an open society.
Steve Goldstein with the Philadelphia Inquirer. So in advancing the Soros doctrine, what are you proposing to do other than funding Americans coming together and other organizations that might lead to the removal of President Bush? What are the concrete steps that you are now doing as you reorient the works of your foundation and philanthropy?
Let me just say that discussions of political activity are off bounds in this discussion.
Why is that?
Because this is a meeting sponsored by the Open Society Institute, and there are limits to what foundations can engage in. So, Mr.
Does
Soros
it threaten the 501c?
Mr. Soros speaks in other forums where he can answer those.
That is why I was not so happy that I was chosen as the first speaker here. I would have preferred another venue where I can speak freely as to what I, as a private individual, am ready to do.
Well, can you say what you're ready to do without identifying the political, shall we say, action that you're indulging in?
Well, I certainly want to foster a debate, and I want to bring this out in the open, and have people think about where we are going. And there are different ways of doing it, and one way is to speak out, and that I'm doing here and I will do elsewhere. And there are other things that I can do, and I will also do them.
Yes, my name is Jeff Aronson. I was wondering if you believe that our deepening involvement in Iraq has the capacity to force a change in the preeminent view now, the predominant view today of this aspiration to supremacy.
Yes. No, I think that we are at the moment of truth. You know, I draw a parallel between what's happening to a stock market bubble. When things get, you know, a stock market bubble has always a basis in reality, but then there is a misconception that carries it to what I call far from equilibrium grounds. And the reality is that we are, in fact, the dominant power in the world. The misconception is that we ought to use that dominance to further our dominance and to impose our will on the world, whereas, in fact, we have become dominant exactly by not using it in that way. And so we have gone off the rail. We have gone from normal conditions to abnormal conditions. And September 11 played a very important role in getting us into that state. And I think September 11 has been misused by our leadership to lead us in a direction that they wanted to take the country. It enabled them to do so. They couldn't have done it without the assistance of the terrorists.
Can Iraq burst the speculative bubble you just invoked?
I think that you know, just as in a bubble, you have a moment of truth, and afterwards you have a twilight area where you still go on, but you lose the conviction and the forward drive, and then you reverse course. I think that this is the moment of truth, and I think the people, we are living in a democracy. This is an open society. We can speak out, and I think people will listen and will draw their conclusion from it, and there will be a reversal. I'm very hopeful on that.
Michael Blaine, Soros fellow. I was wondering, the human rights conversation that we have here at home around race and incarceration, how do you feel that translates into what we're doing abroad?
Well, I think that the Patriot Act really deprives us from the high moral ground that we had before in advocating human rights abroad. It has weakened our position, because the other regimes that defend themselves by dubious means can rightfully claim that they are doing it to defend themselves. So if we are now abandoning our standards, we are weakening our case, our standing for advocating human rights abroad. It's a very sad outcome.
Yes, in the middle of the back.
In response to Mathnaz's question, you answered that one of the first steps is for the United States to realize that it's infringing on due process rights, or that it's beginning to erode some of its basic freedoms. Can you explain or give your view on the role of the U.S. media?
The role of what?
The United States media, in either helping the United States to have an awareness or inhibiting it from having that awareness?
Well, that's actually one of the remarkable aspects of the current situation, because we do have freedom of speech and we do have diverse media. And it is really has been a great surprise to me how the media have been carried on a wave of patriotism to suspend their critical role that they ought to be playing in an open society. I think it's the balance is sort of coming back, and we do have diverse media, and I think you can see the sea change in the discussion now, since we got mired in this Iraqi quagmire.
Yes, Don Krause, Campaign for UN Reform. There's been tremendous misinformation on the part of this administration regarding the UN and other international institutions. What role do you see the process that you're embarking on in terms of correcting any of that, or what role do you see for international institutions in the future of the United States and the world?
Well, you touch on a sort of a rather large subject because the United Nations is a very useful institution, but it has its own limitations because it is an association of sovereign states, and sovereign states generally look after what they consider their national interests and rather than looking after the common interest, and that is a serious limitation on the functioning of the United Nations. So when I advocate international cooperation, I don't necessarily mean that it has to be within the confines of the United Nations. I was all for the intervention in Kosovo, which was not sanctioned by the United Nations. So the United Nations is one of the international institutions we have, but we need to strengthen our international institutions. And actually, I didn't have time to expand my ideas of a better world order, but I would advocate forming a community of democracies that would, let's say, form a caucus within the United Nations, among other institutions. And instead of the group of 77, you would have a caucus of democracies, which would effectively form a majority and would ensure that non-democratic countries are not elected to the Security Council, that the Human Rights Commission is not headed by Libya, and so on. So I think that there is room for improving the way the United Nations functions.
Carol Garcia with Winrock International. I wondered whether you could comment either on the positive or negative role that the international business community has in fostering open societies.
Well, business is conducted for profit. The first obligation of the manager of a business is to produce profits. And therefore, you can't look to the business community to solve the problems of the world. There are some very decent businessmen, but they are limited by what they can do because of their responsibility to the shareholders, and if they don't fulfill that obligation, they'll be kicked out from the management of the company. So while enlightened businessmen can make a contribution, the idea that you can leave it to business or you can leave it to markets to take care of the collective interest, I think is an idle dream.
And yet you've seen that there's been a major role that the private sector has played in the development of policy and in the unfolding of policy in Iraq and in other areas.
Well, I don't know exactly, what you're alluding to. You may be alluding to the sort of influence of the defense and oil industry on policy. That's another subject.
My name is Lee Rettiner, and sir, it seems to me 4 options have arisen today, only one of which is new and hasn't been spoken of yet. Your option of creating a new community of democracies, which in a sense is pronouncing the UN a little bit dead.
I ask you to just focus on the question.
I can't without stating the premise of the question. The second, and I'll try to more just as quickly as possible. The second is improving the United Nations. its failures, I don't mean in the Security Council, but over the past 20 years, and through the dominance of the Group of 77 and the New World Economic Order, gave Wolfowitz the right, the power, and the philosophical justification, and those like him, to do what he has now done. That's part of the answer to the question that was asked earlier. So improving the United Nations, which is a long sought after goal, is one to which great effort would have to be given. But there's another way, would be entirely unconstitutional, but I advance it not for the sake of humor, but only to help thought, which is to create a third branch of Congress for foreign governments only. Proportionate representation in the United States Congress, so that the Chinese can legitimately give money, so that Israel can give us money.
Yeah, I need to ask you to get...
That's okay. Let me react to it.
The question is whether we need, and whether Mr. Soros and his foundations can help to bring more foreign influence into the United States instead of relying on what is essentially a balance between Democrats and conservative Republicans, which hasn't worked and is not about to start working.
Look, I think you put your finger on a very important flaw in the current world order, and that is that only Americans have a vote in Congress, and yet it is the United States that basically determines policy for the world. That is a flaw in the current setup. I don't think you can correct it by giving Chinese government a vote in Congress, but it is a flaw, and I think this is where American leadership is needed to take into account and respect the interests of others as well, in order to retain the dominant position we currently enjoy.
I would call that participatory democracy.
Well, participatory democracy doesn't always work, as you can currently see in California.
We'll take one more question back here.
Jerry Paulson. While the Bush administration and the people who've created this notion of the Bush doctrine have been looking for a place in which to exercise the doctrine, how much do you think oil played a part in the selection of Iraq as the place in which to try and implement this doctrine?
I think it played a very important role, and not totally unjustified, because there are legitimate concerns about the reliability of Saudi Arabia as the main supplier of oil. We are dependent on oil, so I don't think it's an illegitimate concern, but I think has been very deceptive that it was not at all discussed. That in fact, I was at a meeting debate where somebody started talking about oil, and the defenders of the policy said, "Do you mean to say that we are doing this for oil?" As if that were somehow unpatriotic. So this is where the deception has come in. But I think the concern with oil is a legitimate concern.
Well, let me thank you all for coming, thank our speaker, and invite you all to join us across the street at 1120 19th Street at the Open Society office for some refreshments and continued discussion. Thank you.